As you know, PSI and Maverick, we love to break up with convention and go where others won't. And using business practices to solve social problems and challenge harmful conventions is part of our DNA. As most of you know, over 50 years ago, PSI's founders, Phil Harvey and Dr. Tim Black, created a mail order business selling contraception, sex toys, and adult films. And that business grew into the company now known as Adam and Eve, which provided the seed capital for PSI. Over the years, PSI launched and grew social businesses around the world, raising additional grant capital for things that I say are seen and used, products and marketing campaigns, for example. What we didn't have was the support for the less seen and the arguably less sexy things like optimizing operations. And then we met Shailene Nanalingham, who unfortunately couldn't make the call because it's midnight in Hong Kong, but hopefully you will, get to know her more through this amazing conversation that she has in our issue page. Shailene invested in staffing up and optimizing our social business unit. And this was one of those very rare and exceptionally valuable investments in core operations, which was then followed by Maverick member Hillary Ham's investment in launching a social business in Kenya, which provided the foundation and a template for developing and launching a global social business via in 2021. And we are going to hear about via and about our social business unit a little bit later with the amazing Marcy Cook. But what does this all mean to an investor, to someone who cares deeply about impact first, but is also interested in financial return? How do those of us with significant resources and a commitment to women's health and equity deploy all forms of capital around an aligned set of values? And so I'm so thrilled to introduce Erin Harkless Moore, Senior Director for Investments at Pivotal Ventures, to help us get into this conversation. And of course, for anyone that didn't know, Pivotal and Maverick share a co-founder in Melinda French Gates. And we really share a vision for accelerating equality through high impact investments, partnerships, and advocacy. And I think we can all agree that we are all fueled by restless optimism. So Erin and I are going to chat for a few minutes. Then I'm going to hand it over to Audrey to introduce and moderate our next speakers and conversation. As always, please put questions and comments in the chat, and we'll have a lot of time toward the end to open up the conversation to everybody. So thank you so much for being here, Erin. And just to start, could you tell us a little bit about Pivotal, how it got started, and really what makes you kind of an unusual actor in the investment space?
Yes. Hi, good morning. Oh, sorry, my camera just did that weird reset thing. Good morning, everyone. Rita, thank you for the kind introduction. It's great to be here and excited for this conversation today. So to get to that question, a little bit about Pivotal, and I like that word unusual because I do think we are, trying to really change the game for gender equity and advance women's power and influence using a variety of different tools and levers to do it. But to start a little bit at the origin story, Pivotal's been around now almost 9 years, and we're on a mission to bring more opportunity and equality to people here in the United States. And gender is a huge component of that for us. Our biggest commitment is $1 billion toward advancing women's power and influence. For us, that means getting women in positions to make decisions, control resources, and shape policy and perspectives in their homes, in their workplaces, and in their communities. So really owning and having a seat at the table. And when Melinda founded Pivotal, there was this desire to have an organization that could be flexible, that could be nimble, that could use different forms of capital, different tools to advance social progress and gender equity. So we work across sectors and themes, and I think that is kind of gets to the heart of the question is what makes us different is that we go beyond traditional philanthropy in addition, and that's an important part of our work, and I'll talk about that. But we're also driving social impact through investment capital, specifically investments in venture capital, and also through our policy and advocacy work. So we're working across sectors, trying to drive investments to funds and companies that are led by women, centering women and girls of color, magnifying the transformative impact of our talents, their talents, and contributions, trying to get more women to run for public office, and holding those seats and their ability to succeed once they're in their fostering and creating a modern caregiving system. I could talk about that for the full hour. It's a big point of passion for me personally, because we're all caregivers at some point in our lives, but a lot of that burden falls to women, and the systems to support it are completely broken and ripe for innovation and policy to get them back on track, and getting more women into technology roles. So those are a lot of different areas and cross sector work that we do, and we come to the table pulling four kind of key levers to drive our impact. As I mentioned, philanthropy and programmatic work, high impact strategic partnerships. I describe these as our relationships with other large philanthropies, other donors, collectives, again, realizing that despite the resources that Melinda has contributed through Pivotal to advancing women's power and influence, that's still just a tiny drop in the bucket in what we need to achieve gender parity and equity here in the United States. So we need to bring others along with us. Policy and advocacy work, I've spent my whole career as an investor, in the private markets, in sort of the private sector. So I, believe in capitalism and markets and our ability to drive, change and growth, but we can't go it alone. And we need government, we need policy, good policy, sound policy to complement that, and to drive change. So that's another important lever that we pull. And then lastly, the work that I lead and oversee here at Pivotal, in our investment strategy, which I can talk and we'll talk about a little bit more in our conversation today. So, I think it's the complement and realization that, these different tools can play different roles at different times, work together, to drive impact and social change at scale.
Thank you. It's actually amazing to hear about all of it in one place. And what we talked about in our briefing call was like, how do we help break this binary?
Yep,
There's a lot of binaries in the kind of investment and philanthropy space. It's like
yep,
you either do philanthropy or you do investing or even
yep,
impact investing, but those have
right,
been like, separated and siloed.
yep,
You either do policy and advocacy or you do like venture capital, but are those things actually, how could those things actually be in the same portfolio? So I'm
right,
wondering if we could dig there a little bit and talk about how, when you have this very holistic portfolio
mm,
approach around approaches to accelerating gender parity and equity, how do you then think about the spectrum of capital, and
yep,
how do you decide which forms of capital kind of are best used at what times for which
time.
approaches?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it starts with the strategy and having kind of that strategic view and overlay all up across Pivotal. So no one team or no one of those levers is operating in isolation. I think we're all laddering up to that broader women's power and influence agenda, and being very clear and intentional about the different roles that people are playing and different strategies are playing, at different points in time. So I can give a couple of examples I think that illustrate this point, because you're right. It's seen as like a binary, or you can only be a philanthropist, and then being an investor is something different. I think Pivotal, we're showing that that's not the case, right? That philanthropy is correcting for some of the failures in markets, and our work there, and our investing work with a more market orientation and lens is unleashing new solutions. And again, both of those at the same time are needed to drive social impact at scale. So for us, it's like this breaking of the binary is just embedded in our structure. And I'm heartened to see other philanthropists, other organizations, taking similar approaches and being more flexible and nimble, in how they're working, because you need multiple forms of risk capital at different stages, I think, to tackle these big problems. But let me offer back to the example, or an example. Our strategy around women in tech, which is trying to, multifold, get more women into computer science and STEM degrees, debiasing kind of the AI and tech ecosystems more broadly, so that we're not recreating, the flawed models that already exist out in the world. And as a part of that, we view sort of the venture capital space as a important role, right? Because that's the capital engine of, how these businesses are funded. And so we were thinking about these problems from a couple of different sources, right? And the strategy that I lead, we're investing directly into women owned and led funds that are investing maybe way more than some of their male peers into female founders. So we're seeing that impact start to bear fruit. But we were realizing and still seeing a problem around how it's hard to raise a fund, right? Maybe if you don't come from a wealthy background, you don't have, an uncle you can call up and say, oh, here's some money to start investing or even just to fund the operations of the business, right? It locks a lot of people out. So my colleagues on our programmatic team, were thinking about this and said, well, what if we could create using philanthropic capital through a kind of fiscal sponsor, through another nonprofit, an organization that is helping to like make that on ramp smoother for women that want to raise a fund, right? And so providing them effectively some operating capital to put them into business and coaching and other support, discounts with service providers. Because if we show up and say, here, we've got 30 female led funds, like price them as a unit, not individually to bring the cost down for the whole. And so that was a idea that was kind of born on the programmatic side with philanthropic capital in consultation with the kind of return seeking investment side. And it was a collaborative effort. And the partner we identified to do it is a firm that both sides of our teams knew quite well. So there was no proprietariness of like, that's my relationship or, that's my grantee, that's my partner, that's my investee. We were just trying to solve the big problem and realizing that, hey, for there to be great female-led funds for my team to invest in, we got to put them in business, right? And philanthropic capital was a way to start to do that. And so that to me is a perfect example of like the binary, right? Like it was blown up in the sense that we were just trying to solve the problem using all the tools in our toolbox to do it. And it's been really cool to see and talk to some of these women who have said, wow, like that money was $100,000 was transformational and allowed me to focus on investing, building my team, other things because I knew I had that piece covered with the capital that Pivotal was able to provide, through this programmatic partnership.
I know that you talk so much, in Pivotal's messaging about like the need for, you know, funding that's creative, that's flexible, that's innovative. And that to me
Yeah,
is like a great example of, the need for also that type of flexibility and
right.
openness and trust, which is something we talk a lot about in the philanthropy space,
Yeah.
is so necessary, right, in order to really see the type of transformational change. And it's not necessarily an approach that is typical or what we would consider as kind of, in the I see it as a more feminist approach actually to invest.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. And I think again, look, like for me, success, me personally, but I think even for us at Pivotal, is when things are like moving across the spectrum over time, right? Like something that starts and maybe is supported with grant capital, philanthropy, and you're de-risking it or you're putting this model in business or you're giving it the space to sort of test and learn and grow and then maybe that more market rate capital comes in later, still with an impact lens. I mean, I often say, I mean, everything that we're doing is in service of advancing women's power and influence, even if, and Melinda says this all the time, like, she's making money. Like, our goal is to make money with the portfolio of investments. Um, but complementing that with the philanthropy, like it's all going to create the conditions for the outcomes that we want to see. And so thinking about them as isolated, I think is just limiting in some ways. And hopefully as we have more women, all the women on this call, right, trying and pushing different approaches, that will become more of the norm.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, at some point, hopefully, we don't even need a term like impact investing because all investing, like all
Yeah,
businesses, should be generating like positive
exactly,
impact for the
exactly,
world, right? But there's a
exactly,
long way to go.
exactly. I mean,
Yeah.
we could the labels and alphabet soup, that's like a whole nother I could we could get on a soapbox about, or I could get on a soapbox about that because I think it can be distracting, right? And like putting you in a box to say, okay, well, I only do this, or I can only use this type of capital. And I think everyone from some of the biggest foundations, Ford Foundation's commitment to, more impact investing over the last, they're about halfway into that decade commitment. There have been the returns there are better than the returns are on par with the endowment, right? So to me, that is showing the paradigm is shifting and that, we don't need these labels, hopefully, that it's all investing, right? It's all in service of our goals to drive social progress and gender equity.
I think that resonates a lot with women who are on this call right now. And we'll definitely call you out in a few minutes, Christina and Wendy over at the Case for Her, because you all talk a lot about like capital agnostic, or you use terms that I really resonate with me that you'll articulate better than I can. But and I think finally before we move to talk to Marcy, I think that idea of like businesses can start with grant capital and then there's an evolution. I think that resonates a lot with what we're going to hear in the next section around how we've been building VIA at PSI. And, again, as whether you're a whole company like Pivotal or an individual trying to manage even a smaller set of resources, that feels to me like a really important spectrum
Mhm.
for women on this call and others to understand is that you can have both. You can have a portfolio that has return seeking capital investments and philanthropy. You can also have one investment where your definition of return changes over time, and it's really
Right.
actually about being invested long term with an
Right.
entity and
Right.
helping them to evolve its model.
Yeah,
um,
yeah, yeah. And I know one thing we talked about in our kind of briefing call too, Rena, was just this idea of like, yeah, like that full capital stack. And uh, it's important to make sure you're setting up, it's like not exciting, but the kind of governance structure and conditions to allow that to happen, right? And I think if I go back to the origins of Pivotal, there was a lot of intentionality around those pieces of the structure, the accountabilities, how the decisions get made, because that having those right frameworks in place and then defining the themes, the areas that matter to you, building communities like this to share deal flow, to learn best practices and share learnings. Like all of that is part of the journey. But I think it comes back to making sure you've set the right conditions up front, and defined it in the way that works for you and your kind of personal situation, your family, your office, whatever it might be.
It's so great. Well, thank you. I mean, I think that you're also just really helping to redefine what it means to be in this space of private investment, and putting an entirely new narrative and face and idea of what that can be, because it is also like a fairly polarized, when you talk about like private investment space and
Yeah,
philanthropy, there can be a lot of polarization.
yeah,
And so I think that what Pivotal is doing is really breaking up with that archaic narrative and really helping to set a model for all of us. So this is awesome. And I'm going to come back to you in a few minutes because I'm
yes,
excited to
yes.
hear more from you. And, as we dig into some tangible examples here at PSI and around the world. So I'm going to hand it over to Audrey to lead the next conversation.
Thank you so much. I'm Audrey. For anyone who doesn't know me, I'm the head of philanthropic partnerships here at PSI. And I am thrilled today to welcome Marcy Cook. Marcy is our VP of Social Business and Global Operations here at PSI, where she has spearheaded the launch of Via Health, which is PSI's social business solution for women's health. At the core of Via Health is the Via brand. It's an end-to-end solution that promises a frictionless user journey for women where the consumer is CEO. So welcome, Marcy. It's so glad to have you here.
Thank you, Audrey, and thank you for the introduction.
Absolutely. So let's kick off the conversation. Through Via, you are tackling this massive social need. Why did you decide to address this challenge through a social business?
Sorry, mute problems. Great question, Audrey. Thank you. I think as Rena has mentioned and alluded to about the evolution of PSI, as many people might know, has been operating in the private sector space, selling products and delivering services for over 50 years. It's the DNA of how we were founded. But as we know, our markets have evolved, funding has changed, and the needs of the women we work with have evolved equally within that ecosystem. When the social business unit was set up in 2018, it was building off of some early successes and taking what had been historically donor-dependent programming, and bringing it to greater financial viability, not entirely independent of donor resources, as a previous conversation identified. Those are still needed at different stages in a business or for different types of interventions. But what we found in what we found in the markets as they evolved sort of economically, as well as in terms of donor support, and in talking to women in communities, was that this environment where the place where we target mostly middle income, missing what we consider the missing middle consumer segment. And what we found when we were engaging with them, and some of the research that we did as part of the Maverick funding and as part of our social business evolution, was that not only did they still find the ecosystem confusing and producing and kind of stigma oriented, and they lacked kind of this environment where they could receive information and engage in a supportive way. But they also found, especially in the countries in which we worked, that this donor and external subsidy environment had created a lot of unreliability within the marketplace. And so the approaching it from a social business perspective allows us to engage in the market in a more sustainable way. It also allows us to leverage different types of financing for different purposes, as was discussed earlier, and to really think about what is the offering that we can provide to women that they want and need in a way that isn't 100% reliant on donor subsidies. So when the donor project ends, the intervention ends, is often what usually happens. And in a social business model, we can sustain that beyond the donor project, and we can flex and lean in as needed for certain interventions where donor funding exists, or we can leverage different types of financing to support kind of broader growth and scale.
It's really interesting to think about the opportunities for even greater impact and sustainability through the business model versus a purely grant funded model. You referenced a couple of times the different types of financing that has enabled you to get this off the ground. Can you share a bit more about how private philanthropy and investments have played a role in this development and growth?
Yeah, thanks for that. The private philanthropy has been critical, as Irina mentioned. The one of the things that traditional funders will often fund is what is the kind of like what an individual sees in the market, and that kind of what you need to actually build the foundations of a business is something that they sometimes will not invest the resources in from a sustainability element. So when we set up the unit in 2018, we were 25 different sets of operations. We didn't manage the operations according to a commercial profit and loss statement. We had efficiencies we could gain around supply chain. And so a lot of those kind of less sexy elements was what Shailene funded. She essentially funded the startup of the unit that allowed us to then figure out was there still a need in market for the products and services that we were offering? And the answer was yes. And then B, if there was need in market, how could we evolve that to better meet what our consumers were asking for? And that was the evolution of VIA. And that research that led to the development of VIA, the brand, the ecosystem model, the idea that it's us and partners, came from the philanthropic investment, both of which were much more flexible than other types of investment that we've seen. We have received other, foundation funding that has allowed us to invest in specific markets from a sustainability perspective. And then we continue to see market-based investment that allows for, say, building out of some of the data sides of the digital aspect that is a critical component of VIA, or riskier, that allows us to kind of engage in those things that may not deliver an immediate return from a financial perspective, but is so critical to understanding the consumer, to aligning the business offering, and to supporting the future kind of leveraging the scale that is the global part of the social business.
You mentioned 25 different sets of operations. And so in this process through Via Health, you're consolidating these, right? Into one brand. I have to imagine this presents some challenges. Can you talk a little bit about what this looks like? How does this make your job harder? What are the opportunities here? Tell us what that looks like.
Yeah, it's great. Yeah, it's not easy. We're consolidating under regional businesses, so we operate in 25 markets. Those are delivered through 9 regional businesses. So as much as possible, we're trying to regionalize because it's more efficient.
Mhm.
We still have a number of product brands in market, so a lot of the programs were built off of mature brands that already have significant market share. So in those instances, those brands stay and they're very market dependent. We have Vive condoms, for example, in Latin America, and we don't have it anywhere else. But when we lean into new product categories, so we've recently engaged in the menstrual health space. We look at a brand that we could then market and sell globally as opposed to market by market. So taking much more of an above market approach. A lot of the investments that we are that we are making within our existing business model um, through our operations in terms of data insight generation. How do we compare across markets? Like, how do we truly leverage the scale that is 25 markets? Is really where the change happens because each business is used to operating independently. And so what we are doing is working with the kind of the global via brand. The in market execution is obviously differentiated because it depends on the stage that market's at, what the most pressing need is, et cetera. But where we're trying to kind of behave differently as a global social business is where does being global make sense and where does kind of adapting for in-market execution make sense? So really leaning into economies of scale and comparability across markets. That's something that we never had as an NGO, where you're often funded at a country by country. We have without going into the details, we're really leaning into kind of data lakes. How do we use insights? How do we bring in insights and use that learning across multiple markets at once, as opposed to market by market? But it's a change. We set up the unit in 2018. We launched the Via brand in 2021, so that's 3 years. All of this while COVID was happening. We've now expanded the Via brand. It's in East Africa, Latin America, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. And so we're looking at doing it incrementally, and really trying to figure out the right balance between what makes sense in a market and what we should lean into at a market level and what makes sense globally.
Makes sense. It's so you've got this huge vision and just a huge opportunity in front of you as you're building this, really just this global vision for healthcare. What would right now, I love this question, what right now would an infusion of private philanthropy allow you to do?
Yeah, so an infusion of private philanthropy would really allow us to build out. I think it would be most useful in terms of building out that consumer insight digital ecosystem, which we, which we, which when you have narrow margins is really hard to invest in over multiple years. And that also contributes to the social behavior change, the content and community elements of VIA, which are so critical to creating a trusted environment for women to engage, and men in some places. We've launched VIA for men in Pakistan, um, to engage in conversations in a stigma, non-judgmental way. So that whole kind of digital ecosystem, what the nonprofit world and I think even in the for-profit world consider social behavior change, which is a critical element of any business if we're thinking about product and service uptake.
Incredible. Thank you so much. We're going to
Thank you.
transition to Q&A here in a minute. Unfortunately, Kiddis wasn't able to join us today for the conversation from Ethiopia, but we do have this opportunity on the call, looking around at the folks who are attending. We just have this wealth of expertise and background information about social entrepreneurship and different types of funding visions for change through different vehicles, just right on this call today. So I'm going to open it up for Q&A. If anybody's got any questions for Marcy or for Aaron to drop in the chat, feel free to do so or raise your hand so we don't miss you. But in the meantime, I'm going to see if I can pull in a couple other folks on the phone, if you don't mind if I pick on you a little bit here. I wanted to start off with a question for Christina Youngberg and Wendy Anderson are co-founders of the Case for Her. So Christina is one of our founding Maverick members and a Maverick co-chair. Wendy is our newest member of this year's Maverick Next cohort. And through the Case for Her, I know that you all are delivering a wide range of capital. It's grant capital, it's investment, it's debt capital, convertible notes, everything in between. And I wanted to ask you how do you evaluate the type of funding that's the best for your investments? Or perhaps even more provocatively, what type of funding is not necessarily right for investments at a particular time? We would love to hear more from you if you've got a couple minutes to jump on.
Well, first of all, I just wanted to say, oh, and then it goes into a funny view. Hold on. I wanted to say thank you to Erin for joining and just recognize the leadership of Pivotal and the Women Power and Influence program that I know a few of us Mavericks really took advantage of last year through the philanthropy workshop and Women Moving Millions. And also acknowledge that through that program, I was able to move some very necessary capital to some incredible organizations addressing some of these highly stigmatized key women's health issues that my partner Wendy and I have been investing in over the last 15 years. And I'm so grateful that I think Wendy and I realized that there really was this funding spectrum that we could take advantage of as two early philanthropists. And I think we've been pretty seamlessly moving up and down from grant funding all the way to venture capital, where we've been funding first time and emerging female fund managers the past 4 or 5 years. Great funds like the Helm and Amboy Street, RH Capital, which of course has a very strong Maverick founding member sitting there, Stacia Bremski. So we've definitely been able to move all the capital, and we've been doing it because we've needed a seat at the table. Because at its very core, the Case for Her, we sort of understood somewhere along there that it was really our voice and our advocacy that was going to make a difference and get menstrual health, sexual pleasure, and abortion access on the global health agenda. So we've been moving again, very different types of capital. We've just seen the money as a tool and applied it in the most useful way. Obviously, there are certain things where investment capital doesn't make sense. So, for instance, what kind of investments can we make to de-risk these areas for the next funders, for the scale funders? And investment capital wouldn't be appropriate for research into metrics for the next funders to measure. And philanthropic capital is not necessary for let's say a femtech company that's addressing products or services in menstrual health or sexual pleasure. So it's been incredible as we've been on this journey for over a decade, how effective and impactful it's been to move the different types of capital to get a seat at the table, and then really to gather evidence and de-risk for the next funders.
And I would just add to that. Hi, thanks for letting me join. This is
Welcome.
exciting. But I'd add to that, it required us actually to take a trust-based relationship with our entrepreneurs and the organizations that we deal with, and to really believe in what they were seeing and what they believed in, because you can't track and you can't use your KPIs in the same way given the kinds of capital that we're dispersing. So it really requires that you dig in and you believe and you build a relationship with these individuals and you're comfortable with that relationship, and then yeah, and then we disperse the capital really based on what the organization or the entrepreneur has explained to us will best suit their need and what we see from our own experience. We've sometimes suggested a different model of capital as safe as opposed to a working capital loan, and it also helps that I think we're a little bit I don't say uneducated, but we didn't have a background in philanthropy, so we didn't know what you were supposed to do. So we could make it what we wanted it to be. And that's given us a lot of freedom.
I
You know,
think maybe something else interesting to add to that journey is that after finishing up the philanthropy workshop, they kind of said, you can spray and pray, or you can bet on an organization that you're pretty sure your gut is telling you is the right decision. And that was Acumen. I really aligned with Acumen, which uses grant funding to make for-profit investments in social enterprises on a global level. Alongside that, becoming a founding member of Maverick, which also I think, teaches and gives a really important lesson in trust-based philanthropy and a high risk tolerance and really going on a journey. Those two things really influenced our strategy.
And having a good partner.
In a way, it's actually really powerful to hear you say, you didn't bring a background in this type of investment and type of capital before you came into it. What advice would you have for any other maybe early stage philanthropists who, we love here at Maverick, who might be interested in expanding from giving philanthropic capital to offering different types of investment capital as well? How do you take those first steps?
Well, if it's for the two of us, I'll just say I just firmly, oh, maybe it's for everyone. I just firmly believe that women who can write checks need to write checks for other women.
Yeah.
So figure out the most strategic way to get more capital in the hands of women so that we can get investments into the goods and services that we need would be one thing. And if we look at our personal portfolios, and I think I'm probably speaking to the right audience here, our philanthropy is such a small portion of our portfolios. I think both Wendy and I have been insanely bold in moving our investment capital in concert with our philanthropy. Um, Even the pools where we really expect to have a significant return, and it's gotten so personal that I mean I really think about aligning the whole portfolio. And you have communities or networks like Tonic where they have the 100 percenters. I'm not there, but it's certainly something that I think about.
Yeah. We've aligned all of our personal capital actually against our values, a climate value and a gender lens at this point. And then when it goes into the philanthropic capital, it's just a matter of getting started. I think you can start small and build up if that makes you more comfortable, or you can start with a single instrument and feel comfortable there. Um, I don't think you can ever be perfect. And I think there's this fear of making a mistake. I think as long as you don't do any harm, but you just need to get started.
It's great advice. Erin, can I bring you back into this conversation as well? Would love to hear if you've got any reactions to what Christina or Wendy said, or anything to add in terms of your own advice for folks kind of exploring how to offer different types of capital.
Yes, no, I mean, I don't know if folks could see me. I mean, I was smiling profusely, Christina and Wendy, and what you were saying, and just hearing how you've activated your portfolios holistically, I think is exactly the type of what everyone should be doing, right? So kudos to you both, and just really awesome to see that in action. I mean, I think it's just echoing what was said, an element of don't, kind of let perfect be, be the enemy of the good. Like just get started, right? And like find the things that, you know, you can wrap your head around, and leveraging these communities too, these communities of practice, like the one here, like Tonic. Like, I mean, there's so many organizations out there that I think of folks that are investing with intentionality for impact, aligning their values, that I'd say, yeah, just, find that support that you need, but start to do it, and then reflect and learn. I mean, and I think be okay to be public with some of those learnings and mistakes too. There are many things that have not worked probably here at Pivotal, and in my career as well. I'd say if you're not taking the right risks if everything's going well. And I think we need to be okay with, some things maybe not working, and sharing those lessons and learning, and continuing to push forward. So that would be just extending that point of advice. And in the chat, I just to jump in on like the question around, is this like a women's bubble? It's interesting. I mean, I have been in other forums, and I think now these topics have to me become much more mainstream. I mean, I don't know if any of you have attended like, Mission Investors Exchange type events or Confluence Philanthropy, like, 10 or 15 years ago, it was like, well, should we do it? How do we even get started? And now it's like that conversation is done and people are doing the work, right? and that's representing philanthropy of all sizes, male and female, led. So, I think these conversations are happening across, the ecosystem, maybe with a bit more care in a forum like this than others, but that's my read on it. But I'd be curious how others are seeing it too.
Any thoughts on this? Marcy as well. I know that you're in a number of these different spaces. Do you see this more as a gendered space, or is this type of investing spectrum? Do you see this also more in kind of traditional investing spaces or male circles as well?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think we do see it across. I think it's evolved in the last, and I don't know if others would feel the same, that in the last like 5 to 7 years, the thought process around how you allocate capital has evolved. I think from an implementer's perspective, it's still a little hard to navigate, and how you kind of bring the different types of resources together, particularly as a global company. How do you do this at scale? And how do you do this? I think there's some differences still within the kind of timing and and interests of the different types of investment. So if you can access it through sort of one fund, for example, and within that fund, you can blend different types of capital. It's easier to navigate from a service provider perspective than if you're trying to stitch that together yourself. But I have seen this evolve over the last, I would say, 5 to 7 years, at kind of upstream level, as well as sort of how you engage within the ecosystem at, say, maybe a regional level. And I think I don't know if it's more intentional within the women's and gender space as opposed to kind of outside of that. I think we definitely see more interest by women to invest in women than we do kind of big funds to invest in women's health issues in particular.
Can I pick on Miller to come join in the conversation as well, if you've got a couple minutes?
Yeah,
Miller,
go
I know
ahead.
you are also a social entrepreneur and you're working in the menstrual health space. And we've talked a lot today about different types of capital that funders provide, but we know that often funders and different organizations operating in the space offer a lot more than funding, often different types of advice or technical input. Sometimes it might even be too much advice and too much ideas and input. And so I would love to hear from you in your journey. Of course, funding is always needed to grow, but what else is needed to grow a social enterprise, kind of get it off the ground? What has been really useful for you? What has not been useful? What's been really helpful in this journey so far?
Wow, I really appreciate that question because it's not a question I'm asked in the spaces that I spend the most time in. And so maybe that within itself kind of really speaks to what's helpful. My therapist said something recently when I was having a little bit of a spiral. And he said when you're building an anti-patriarchal organization, you can't build in the way patriarchy subscribes. And so I think that really speaks to something that Raina focused on earlier, which was around this funding binary of like either you do philanthropy or you do investment. And these two things are totally separate and never in conversation with one another. And so I think that the most helpful thing that can come in shape of mentorship or in terms of funding or in terms of just like a friend in a social relationship is this flexibility and this open-mindedness and this willingness to not think in such rigid silos about the work that we do. And there's nothing to me that's more empowering than finding a partner, a mentor, a cheerleader, a customer um, who who gives us the trust that Wendy mentioned to be agile and to be adaptable and to be problem solvers because that kind of that attitude I came from the academic global health space and one of the reasons that I moved into social enterprise is because I just didn't feel like there was flexibility in funding that allowed us to really innovate and that was challenging. And in work like menstrual health, which can be a gateway to lifelong, agentic, empowered reproductive health and just kind of larger healthcare decision making for women and girls. Um, we needed to be able to get creative, and we couldn't just do this kind of um, activities that spoke to the the grantor's wishes and KPIs. But in the corporate space, we couldn't also just do um, these kind of like milestones and thresholds for traction in the marketplace. And so there's this whole new space for like opportunity and play, if we're willing to get curious and creative about how we approach, how we measure success, how we think about traction, how we look at engagement. And having partners that are willing to just be flexible and willing to use their imagination a little bit, I think is the most valuable thing that I've found. And then also, this goes without saying, but community. I just conversations like this put fuel in my tank to kind of get through the rest of my day. And it can be really hard as an early stage founder to justify taking an hour to have a conversation just for the sake of having a conversation that doesn't necessarily have like an outcome or an objective or an agenda. And that's something that I'm really working on, because this is generative. Like this is what allows us to keep moving forward. Um, and so, I mean, I see in the chat like Darlie throwing in our website and Christina throwing in what Anna's building, and it's just so cool. Like, and so to the point about, are men doing this? Maybe. I don't know. I can't speak to that. But women have been doing this forever, and it's our superpower. And so in that sense, I think um I don't know, it's really powerful, and the ability to just build connective tissue within each other and lift each other up, I think is just like one of the most one of the most transformative things we can do for other women and for causes, whether they be in the private sector or the public sector, that are meant to empower women and girls.
Thank you so much. This is really just a note to end on here. As we kind of bring the conversation to a close, Erin, Marcy, any final thoughts on this final point that Miller raised that I think really beautifully sums up the conversation today, or anything else to close us out?
No, I just want to, I love this is our superpower.
Hmm.
I think that's 100% accurate. And I just want to say, I feel you around especially as we're trying to, I feel you on taking the time out to engage with the community and being supported by is so important, but sometimes so hard to do when you're trying to deliver on the business and build it. Yeah, but it's so important. I'm gonna steal this is our superpower. Thank you.
Same. I think we've had great words to end on. If you found that superpower, own it and use it. So let's go out and do it.
Love it. I love it. Well, thank you all. This has been, just such a rich discussion and absolutely the highlight of my day. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you to those of you who joined as attendees and then joined as part of the conversation as well. I'm going to turn it back over to Rena to wrap us up for today.
Thanks, Audrey. And yeah, thank you so much, all of you, Christina and Wendy Miller. It's so amazing to hear your experiences. And also, as always, Christina and Wendy, just your bold calls to action, like calls to move, like, let's go, right? Like, write big checks, get involved, take part in community, ask hard questions. To Erin's point, like, don't be afraid to fail. And that goes for those of us who are, on the enterprise side and those on the investment side. Like, this is all about taking risks and trying new ways of working, breaking up with the antiquated patriarchal system that we have been operating in and are forced to operate in, while also trying to really kind of chip away at it and rewrite the narrative, redefine what it means to be an investor and to create impact and to create return. So it's really just a very inspiring call to action for all of us. And I hope that that you walk away kind of feeling just like you have a little bit more of a sense of the ways that you can activate the tools in your toolbox. And if you still aren't sure, you've got an incredible network of women, both within the membership as well as those of us, at Maverick and PSI, who can really help you figure out what those tools are and how to activate them, starting right now, like starting today. Like as Wendy said, just getting off the starting block. So I know I'm mostly preaching to people that already have gotten off the starting block, at least in some aspects of your portfolio, but hopefully you're walking away with a sense of how to do it more broadly. And so just want to reiterate my thanks so much for coming into this conversation, for Marcy for taking the time out of your day, and Erin especially for taking the time out from your, amazingly demanding and impressive schedule to spend time talking to us, and really again for leading the way at Pivotal. I mean, you guys have a massive brand and platform, which also comes with a lot of responsibility to uphold the integrity of all of those values. And I can't even imagine actually the type of kind of, with the visibility that you have, you're also constantly having to defend the decisions that you're making and the risks that you're taking. And that is something that a lot of people might not really recognize how hard that is. So just to see you and acknowledge you and say like, and thank you for the kind of ways in which that you are boldly trying to change the world with a very visible platform, and recognizing that sometimes it works really well and other times it doesn't, and we kind of learn and keep going. So that's that's the superpower. That's the kind of, I think, bold responsibility that women are taking in this space right now. And just, yeah, cheers to every single one of us and every single one of you on the call. Please follow up. Please go into issue and check out Shailene's amazing kind of dialogue about her experience. Learn more about Via, learn more about the investments Pivotal is making in women and women of color here in the US. We're a global community that's investing across the world, and many of you are really invested here in the US as well, particularly on issues that Pivotal is championing. So they are an amazing resource if you're looking to put more dollars into funds and companies and nonprofits right here. Um, so I'm going to end there and just hope that you all have a wonderful rest of your day.